thanks very much, and thanks very much for inviting me and for welcoming me. And also, thanks very much to Alan Davis for his very kind words. It's my first time here in Built Wells, not for want of enthusiasm, but in the past, every time I've thought about coming to visit the show, I investigate travel options and discover that it's slightly easier to get from London to New York than it is to get from London to Built Wells. So I've never quite managed it before, and I'm pleased to have done so now, and to see that the view is indeed much nicer than the view from Westminster. And I've also, of course, realised that it's not Built Wells' fault for being too far away from London, it's London's fault for being too far away from Built Wells. I think the programme labels me as giving an English perspective. As Alan Davis was saying, obviously we negotiate as the UK in Brussels, and ministers from the UK government negotiate on behalf of the UK as member state, clearly reflecting a government view which takes into account the need to hold a majority in a parliament which covers the whole of the UK, but also on devolved issues like agriculture, trying to work very closely with devolved administrations to ensure that we are reflecting the full diversity of agriculture across the UK. So what I'm going to do is just say a few words about the European process, the likely timetable, and what that means on some key issues which I think are potentially particularly relevant in Wales. I've got, I think, 15 minutes. I'm afraid once I start opening my mouth on the European process, I can just carry on for a long time. I'm hoping that Wynne will stop me as soon as I get to 15 minutes, because the important thing for me is actually to listen to your comments and to listen to your questions so that I have a good idea of what's in your mind, rather than giving you too much of an idea of what's in my mind. But anyway, to provide a bit of overall context, obviously every 7 years in Europe we reset the budget framework, we set out the intended expenditure over the next 7-year period, and we reset the rules governing how that money is spent. That creates significant periodic uncertainty for agriculture. It's a downside to being in a very heavily subsidised sector. You're then quite dependent on that decision-making process. Let's start with how the budget is set, and that is set, it needs to be set before most member states will consider themselves able to agree the detailed rules on how the money can be spent, and it is done at head of government level. So David Cameron and his counterparts from other member states will be aiming to nail down an agreement on the headline figures. They tried in November, I think came reasonably close to an agreement, but didn't quite manage to land it. And they will be trying again, as David said, at the end of this week. We're hopeful that we will get a resolution. Obviously, the UK has some very clear objectives. In particular, you'll often hear reference to the rebate, but obviously, following the vote in the House of Commons, it's clear that the government will have to aim to ensure no overall increase in the money paid out from the European budget. We have a number of allies among other member states on that issue, but it's one that's controversial. About a week or so ago, I was reasonably optimistic that we will get a deal. I'm still, I think, optimistic that we'll get a deal, but I'm slightly concerned by some of the language we've heard from other member states, in particular the French government recently, painting themselves into something of a corner. So it's starting to sound as if some other member states might not be looking to secure a deal, and that's concerning. I think we still got a slightly better than 50% chance of getting a deal, but that's just my guess rather than based on any special information. In November, what was put on the table was a 2% reduction, roughly, in what the Commission had proposed in terms of the budget for direct payments, and a rather steeper reduction in what is called Pillar 2 spending, so the funding for rural development programmes around the EU, with a proposed reduction of 9%. There was also a suggestion that member states would have some flexibility to transfer resources from their Pillar 1 budget, the direct payment budget, into their rural development budget, and a suggestion that the capping that had been proposed by the European Commission on large recipients of direct payments would be made voluntary at member state and regional level. Anyway, we'll see if something similar to that goes through by the weekend. The good music is that if there is no budget deal this time around, we may have to wait quite a bit longer. Certainly the German government has been saying that they don't want to have a budget deal intervening too close to their elections, which are in November. And there's a serious risk that if we don't get it sorted now, we will be waiting until November and beyond before we can agree the budget for the next 7-year period. So that generates more uncertainty, particularly around those who are thinking about making investments in a farming business, thinking about what they need to do about their entitlements. I recognise that uncertainty is unwelcome. That's the very high-level process setting the budget. Once we have clarity on the budget, we'll be able to agree the detailed legislation. That needs to be agreed between, on the one hand, the European Parliament, and on the other hand, member states meeting in the European Council. And that will be agriculture ministers from around the EU gathering together and agreeing on the legislation. And both those two institutions need to agree on the same text. The Irish presidency, which is currently the presidency of the EU, hopes to reach an agreement in June of this year. So they're planning to get agreement at the level of council, so agriculture ministers from the member states at the March council meeting, and then there's a process of shuttle diplomacy with the European Parliament. So we're hoping, fingers crossed, we get a budget deal at the end of this week, and then that we get a council deal in March, and then that we get agreement with the European Parliament in June. And then, once we get the detailed implementing rules from the European Commission, that will mean that potentially we're ready to implement a new CAP regime, a new regime for direct payments from the 1st of January 2015. There are issues around transition particularly for rural development programmes and some of the expenditure under rural development programmes, but we can touch on some of that under the questions if necessary. I'll just quickly talk about a few issues. I mean, obviously greening is a very important issue. It looks as if it's likely to become more flexible than proposed by the European Commission, but also potentially more, I'm going to say more complex, but there will be some rules which are difficult to understand over which farms have to do precisely what, based on numbers of hectares and so on. In terms of permanent pasture, we're expecting flexibility to run that at a regional level rather than to impose a bureaucratic requirement at individual farm level. On crop diversification, we're expecting that some smaller holdings or holdings with relatively small levels of arable crop will become exempt. Ecological focus areas, we think that's likely to become a less demanding requirement, with some flexibility for member states to specify themselves exactly what they want. And there's also increasing likelihood that those farms which are participating already in agri-environment schemes will be considered to be green by definition. And that's an approach which seems to be gaining traction both within the European Parliament and in the Council. There are then some questions over whether people are then being paid twice for exactly the same activity, which certainly we would have difficulties with. A particular issue for Wales, and less so for England, is of course the proposed move to a flat rate payment. We, as the UK, have obviously been pressing for greater flexibility for regions to make their own decisions about the way in which that move towards a per hectare payment takes place, and also to ensure that there is enough flexibility to define regions in much the same way that we have done in England, specifying different regions for the moorland, the severely disadvantaged area, and the rest of the country, to avoid too significant a shift between farm businesses. It looks as if it's likely that certainly the Parliament will be pressing for greater flexibility for member states and regions, and we expect Council to move in that direction as well. Another important issue is areas of natural constraint, which is the proposed new designation to take over from less favoured areas. There is some pressure from the European Parliament and some individual member states to delay the redesignation and delay that process, and in a sense kick it into the long grass forever. We would have difficulties with that from a UK perspective. We've had auditors' reports from 10 years and further ago pointing out that across the EU there's no particularly rational basis for designation of some of these areas. We have a situation where 98% of Luxembourg is regarded as a less favoured area. Apparently because it's difficult to persuade people to farm in Luxembourg, they have too much possibility to get much more attractive salaries working as bankers in Luxembourg city centre. That doesn't strike me as being a rational approach, and we need to ensure that we move to a system which renews the designation. I think we've been pretty successful in getting the rules defined so as to reflect what is a reasonably robust system already within the UK and in the different parts of the UK. So we're not expecting significant change to emerge within the UK. And then there's the issue of entitlements, where the Commission has proposed a quite complex mechanism where those who were exercising entitlements in 2011 would then be able to take part in a reallocation of entitlements in 2014, if they are, on the basis of the hectares they're farming in 2014. That, on the face of it, ludicrously complicated arrangement was designed to deal with the risk of landowners taking land back in hand and ending tenancies in order to ensure that they have control of the land. Whether the Commission's proposals actually do that adequately is an open question. For us in England, actually, this is quite a simple issue to deal with. We're hoping that we'll get flexibility just to roll our existing per hectare entitlements forward. Obviously, we're working very closely with colleagues in the Welsh Government to ensure that we get the right system for other parts of the UK. I think what matters most to farming businesses is getting early clarity on what the rules are, and then people can start to make business decisions based on that. I think I'll just touch briefly on some of the other sticking points in the negotiation. On capping, obviously the UK government will prefer not to have a compulsory capping mechanism, and we hope that we will get that flexibility. On coupled payments, we have been concerned that the Agriculture Committee in the European Parliament has been proposing much greater coupling of direct payments to production in individual sectors, and adding new sectors to the list of sectors which can have coupled payments, including rather puzzlingly tobacco. And that obviously is a concern for us. We will want to ensure that we continue the move away from coupled payments towards a more flexible system of expenditure. On the sugar sector, we will be hoping that Parliament and Council follow through on the commitment to phase out quotas and stop getting in the way of farmers which want to invest in that particular sector. And then on the rules governing how the Commission and the European budget can intervene in times of market crisis, we're concerned that the European Parliament wants to make that a much more automatic process. And rather than the Commission making a judgment about whether a crisis exists, they're saying that if the price drops below level X, at that point automatically the European budget will intervene. One of the concerns about that is that it then generates a lack of predictability for direct payments, because if you end up spending too much money subsidising prices in the event of a crisis, that's taking money away from the budget, and you have to then start top-slicing direct payments in order to fund that. And that, we think, generates some risks. I won't go into too much detail. You will have heard, it's always slightly embarrassing when someone tells you that their disagreement is not with my minister, not with me, but with my minister, because it sort of implies that there's a difference of view between me and my minister. Just to be absolutely clear, there is no difference of view between me and Owen Paterson. I'll set out some of the things that Owen Paterson has been articulating, I think, very clearly on his vision for the CAP. And he's been making it clear that he doesn't think that income support is a sensible long-term objective for public expenditure. He would like to see essentially the prices left to the market, and he has, though, made it very clear that he recognises he's not going to get to that position overnight. So when Alan Davis talks about the risk of abrupt changes, it's clear that we're not going to have very abrupt changes as a result of these negotiations. Owen Patterson has also been making it clear that there is a very good case for some public support for the delivery of environmental goods and environmental objectives. He thinks it needs to be done in a much less bureaucratic and rigid way than the Commission's proposals, with much greater local and regional flexibility over exactly what environmental objectives are delivered. And that clearly is relevant in a devolved agriculture system within the UK. And he's also been recognising that if you do away with a direct payment system, that creates specific issues for essentially the less favoured areas, hill farming in particular, and that you might need a mechanism to provide additional payments in those areas in order for businesses to stay in business and be able to provide the environmental and landscape benefits that we look for. He tends to refer to the Lake District in England when he's talking about that. Whether that means that everything has to meet a kind of Lake District standard for attractiveness around England in order to get those less favoured area payments is an open question. But as someone who spends 2 or 3 weeks in the Lake District every year, I very much appreciate his support for the Lake District in particular. Anyway, that's a quick account of where Defra ministers are at the moment. Just to summarise, I guess overall, once we get to the end of these negotiations, and I fervently hope we do get to the end of these negotiations, I think the headline messages are there's probably going to be less money in real terms than there was previously. Probably, though, less of a decline in expenditure in the CAP than there is a general decline in public expenditure. So relatively protected in comparison to other areas of public expenditure. And just to echo some of what the Minister was saying earlier, I think there will be flexibility for regions to use the money more effectively and opportunities to focus the money better on the one hand, improving competitiveness, and on the other hand, the way in which we deliver environmental benefits. And I think there is an important process of consideration and consultation around how regions and parts of the UK make use of the budget and make use of the rules once we've decided on them. But I recognise that we need to get on and decide on the rules to enable you to do that properly. So, thank you very much, and I look forward to questions.